And time to talk to the Shadow Industry Minister Ed Husic. To take us there, here was Gladys Berejiklian on the timing of this ICAC move.
My resignation as Premier could not occur at a worse time, but the timing is completely outside of my control, as the ICAC has chosen to take this action during the most challenging weeks of the most challenging times in the state's history. That is the ICAC's prerogative.
Well, Gladys Berejiklian there raising some concern about the timing of what the Independent Commission Against Corruption have done here and announcing this investigation, with New South Wales, of course, about to embark on the reopening and the end of lockdown. Let's bring in now our guest, Labor's Ed Husic, the Shadow Industry Minister, who joins us from Western Sydney. Ed Husic, thanks for joining the program. I'm just checking you've got us there, Ed Husic. We're just having a bit of an issue. You do? Can you hear me there? Great. All right. Now, we just saw Gladys Berejiklian there raising some concern about ICAC's timing. ICAC is actually not allowed under law to delay or defer investigations. What do you think, though, about the criticism that it's chosen a terrible time to do this?
Well, I guess I'd make a number of points, and firstly, good morning to you and the panel and to the viewers. In response to your question, first off, I would say that it's a bit hard for Gladys Berejiklian to make that point when she started cancelling her own press conferences, her daily press conferences. If this was such an important time, she would be there every single day. So I think that needs to be borne in mind, and I'd urge people to consider that. But I guess overall I can understand the 2 points I would quickly make. I can understand why people are confused and disoriented about the events of Friday, seeing a Premier go that quickly, but it is important to emphasise that the fuse to this explosive event was lit in October 2020, when you had a New South Wales Premier appear before ICAC, being a person who was being monitored, a person of interest, and clearly there was an issue there. And the reality is ICAC did not say or force Gladys Berejiklian to resign. She did that of her own accord, following 12 months of saying that she wouldn't do that. The second thing I'd make, the second point I'd emphasise, is there's been a lot of outpouring of views on one side of the ledger, talking about how unfair this is to Gladys Berejiklian. But I am not in that camp. And I think a lot of the people that I represent and care about here in Sydney's West see that she was a Premier, particularly through this pandemic and this lockdown, for the east and the north of the city. You know, she managed a very ideological, political lockdown that divided the city, saw things happen in the west that would not happen in the north and the east, played politics with public health. And I represent nearly 7,000 largely unvaccinated residents in the suburbs of Chifley that caught COVID. And I could not look those people in the eye and say, I thank Gladys Berejiklian for her service, when really the phrase that should be uttered by her and the New South Wales Liberals is, sorry, we let you down, and then they fix it.
Just on that, the reopening that's coming in the coming weeks, I mean, you do represent a part of Sydney that's been hardest hit by the outbreak and by the lockdown. How do you feel about the reopening at 70% of adults being vaccinated?
As someone who lives in a lockdown LGA, who represents residents who've gone through some of the toughest measures across the LGAs in Western Sydney, we clearly want to get out of this. We, as Labor has said at the national level, support the national plan and believe that we do need to get out as quickly as we can, but it does require in particular a focus on the safety elements of this. We have said, for example, that you've got the tracking, tracing, isolating mechanisms in place, strong, safe hospitals, no groups left behind, and teenagers getting vaccinated. Some of those elements we think should be focused on. And if I can say, David, as someone who represents people in this part of Western Sydney, I get a little bit, I have a funny reaction when I see people say in the media, particularly in terms of politicians in the media, saying we've got to learn to live with COVID. And I look at them and I think, but you got the resources to look after yourself. I represent people that in some cases are holding down 2 to 3 jobs, paying the bills, paying the rent, are heavily reliant on a public health system, can't rely necessarily on private health insurance, to say to those people without health supports in place, without the investment in place, that they can be looked after, that is just untenable from my perspective and is a factor that has to be considered in any discussion about opening up.
So do you, just to be clear on this, do you think it's too soon to open up? Would you like to see the stay-at-home orders, the lockdown, continue further?
We've had a national cabinet, we've had from the federal and state and territory levels consideration about how to do that, stepped out through a phased plan that talks about what things may include in those different elements of the plan, and where it's right to do so, where it's safe to do so, then absolutely. I think the country wants to and needs to get out of lockdown.
So that's what I'm asking.
And we need to be able to have that confidence.
Do you support this?
Yes. Yeah, look, I absolutely support the national plan, but I also want to make sure, and I have to, and I'm compelled to do this, David, to speak up for people of my area, that when the spotlight moves from what we've got right now, that the healthcare investment will be there. And my view is that the federal and state Liberal parties are not good for our health in the respect of, do they have the funding there to support people? There are disparities in health outcomes within the city of Sydney, and that'll require investment and focus once the cameras move from this issue and go on to the next thing.
The income supports will stop 2 weeks after the 80% vaccination target is hit. When do you think these payments should stop? Well,
clearly, you don't want to have these supports in place indefinitely. Once the economy starts to get on its feet, then that's not going to be required, right? So that's a point. But I guess a number of things. One is, I watched them with lead feet when they were called to provide support, the federal Liberals with lead feet coming to the party on that, and now, getting ready to race out of support. A lot of what I've seen in the last few weeks coming out of the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, appears to me more like browbeating rather than some definite fact-based position on where things should go.
So what should happen?
Just
to get to the point of what...
Well, if I may...
Okay.
I'll come back to your point, but just let me quickly finish this point. I mentioned disparities. When I talk to chambers of commerce in my area, David, and I talk to their members, they're saying, well, what support is there for us? I think at their heart, the federal Libs still believe that there's some notion of snapback that will kick in and the economy will just go back to normal. And these businesses are saying, we do need support. It ain't going to go back to normal as quickly as you think. And so this needs to be carefully calibrated.
OK, well, clearly, the Treasurer...
Sorry, your question.
The Treasurer is confident that there will be a strong recovery once things open up, and it sounds like you're not as certain of that. Are you suggesting these payments should really be tied to that economic performance rather than the vaccination rate?
Well, I'm sorry. I think we need to take a very close look to any pronouncements made by the federal coalition.
Sure. But what's your view?
Josh Frydenberg.
What's your view, though, Husic?
And so I'm very careful about just accepting on face value what they say.
I hear that.
Remember, so much has happened, 60 billion rounding error in JobKeeper.
I hear that.
I'd be very careful about taking stuff on face value.
I'm just trying to establish for the viewers what your view is as to when these income supports that a lot of people in your neck of the woods are relying on, when should they end? Is it when vaccination hits a certain rate, or is it when the economy hits a certain level of performance?
Well, notionally, you take the vaccination rate, first thing, but you also have to take into account beyond this the state of economies on the ground, the way in which local communities are dealing with this. There are different outcomes in different parts of the country, and particularly outer urban areas and regional areas will have fared differently. So, as I said, in my part of the world, if you look, for example, for instance, the hospitality, entertainment sector, they're not going to go and snap back, quote unquote, to normal once we get to 80%. So we do need to think very carefully about when we lift those payments and take them out, and in doing so, can the economy afford that? And I would absolutely hate to think that Josh Frydenberg thinks he can correct his historic $134 billion budget deficit by ripping out support at a time that might hurt the economy. Okay. They're in government, they got the stats, they got the advisors, they better make the decision in a way that doesn't hurt areas like ours.
Do you think all federal MPs should be required to have a jab?
I have to say, I am very careful about compulsion. I believe we need to take people with us. I do believe at some point you're going to see this emerge more and more as an issue in terms of mandates. I think incentives are a very good way to go. It's why Labor put forward the notion of an incentive policy. In respect of your question directly, I think in terms of MPs, we are in communities where we're seeing a lot of people going into parliaments that bring people from across the country, and I think it is important that MPs take, as has been said, that leadership step of taking the vaccine. Obviously, people are different and will have their medical advice, but it's medical advice, as always, that should guide our decisions, and I hope it wouldn't be anything else that's guiding MP decisions on why they're not taking vaccines.
So should it be mandatory?
I think, well, we haven't had that discussion yet.
Well, your
I'll be
colleague
very interested
Bill Shorten has
hearing
suggested
what
it should be for federal MPs. I'm just wondering what your view is.
So as I said, we haven't had that discussion yet. Bill's put forward that idea. I think it's a very strong argument that's been put forward for the reasons that I've also elaborated a few moments ago. I do think we're in a position where we visit a lot of people in our communities. I'm fully vaxxed. I know a lot of my colleagues in Western Sydney are, and I think we would argue the case that it's important to do that and show to communities that this is an important step that we all do. We can't urge people to vaccinate and not be vaccinated ourselves.
Let me turn to your industry portfolio. You took this role at the start of the year. Have you produced any policies yet? Well,
you've seen, for example, Labor focus on the issue of sovereign capability of rebuilding manufacturing, and you've seen, for example, us argue that in light of even recent studies by the Australian Sovereign Capability Alliance, that when we needed essential items, we couldn't get access to them quickly, that we need to reduce dependencies on imports and global supply chains.
So what's the policy to address that?
We do need to focus on some sectors.
Yeah, understand that. What's your policy?
That is why Labor has put forward, that's why we have put forward, particularly in the industry space, the notion of the National Reconstruction Fund, modelled on the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, $15 billion, importantly administered by an independent board with a clear government mandate that will focus on value-add and resources, value-add and agriculture, looking at things like medical tech, looking at things like renewable low emissions technology, transport, defence capability and emerging capabilities. So we've had that. In terms of resuscitating businesses as well, I might add, what we've put forward is the notion of encouraging a start-up year and seeing young Australians be mentored, supported through university accelerators to start 2,000 new firms a year that will replenish the stock of businesses that have been under pressure through the course of the pandemic. And we'll obviously release policies in the lead up to the election and be able to demonstrate what we think needs to happen in rebuilding sovereign capability, supporting manufacturing, creating jobs, secure employment, finding opportunity for our regions, and obviously rebuilding better than what we had before.
On one of the areas you mentioned there, defence capability, Australia is now committed to nuclear submarines that will either come from the US or the UK, but built here. There's a concern that building them here will take a lot longer. We've never done this before. It would be better in terms of our capability to have leasing or buying of at least some of these submarines before then. What do you think? Do all of them need to be made here?
I think we need to have a clear and actual followed through commitment on local industry commitment and involvement, because what we've had under the Future Submarines program is a sort of slowly decreasing level of industry involvement, where you've seen, for instance, big claims made early on and they haven't been followed through, and there'll be a lot of industries, and in particular the workers within those businesses, concerned about what might happen with their jobs given the sudden shift that we've seen in the last few weeks. And the government hasn't stepped forward and said what will happen, because there is a lot of concern in the sector about the valley of death and the sort of break between what is happening now and what may happen sometime down the track.
So what do you think, though, Ed Husic? Do they, just to be back to the question, do they all need to be made here?
Well, again, we have argued that in terms of that focus, there is something that we can certainly support, a bipartisan approach by both the federal government and the opposition, in being able to look at what's gone on and what can be done to support industry capability. It's early days because we've not had nuclear-powered subs as part of the equipment inventory, and that is going to require a whole range of new arrangements that will need to be put into place. And we think working together is going to be important, not just from a national security perspective, but especially to give comfort to those people, businesses and workers, wondering where is the money going to come from to support them into the future with the work that they do.
All right, Ed Husic, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for your time.